Hello, and welcome to this special edition of Suits and Boots, the TDI podcast series in conjunction with Resourcing Tomorrow. In this series, speakers at this year's Resourcing Tomorrow event discuss some of the key themes that will be covered at the conference. I am Joséphine Quioc, Senior Sustainability Consultant at TDI and today's podcast host. In today's discussion, our speakers will be exploring how players at all tiers of the metals and minerals value chain are looking beyond traditional ESG considerations to adopt and leverage circular economy principles that meet both stakeholder expectations and drive long-term business sustainability and corporate financial goals. From recycling technologies to waste management solutions, we'll be discussing some innovative approaches to reduce waste, maximize resource efficiency, and create value from mining byproducts. We'll also touch on the role of technology in enhancing sustainability within the industry. I am delighted to be joined today for this discussion by Filipe Vasconcelos and Dr. Mathias Schluep. Mathias is the Managing Director of the World Resources Forum, where he is responsible for business operations and the representation of the association to the public. He currently coordinates recycling and e-waste management projects in cooperation with the Swiss State Secretariat of Economic Affairs and the UN Industrial Development Organization. In previous roles, he provided expertise on sustainability issues for projects with countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America for national and international government organizations and the private industry. Filipe is the head of mining, research and development at ArcelorMittal and has more than 2 decades of experience in mining operations and research across major projects. Filipe manages technology and innovation projects across laboratories worldwide, including in Spain, France, Brazil, Canada, and the US. His focus is on decarbonization of the value chain, circular economy, and the integration of the digitalisation and AI to enhance mining, primary processes, and sustainability. Welcome, Filipe and Mathias, and thank you for joining us today. Let's start with setting the scene and trying to exactly understand what we mean by going beyond ESG. Over the past years, we've seen noticeable pushback against ESG, driven by political rhetoric from the current US administration and through the Omnibus package, which seeks to simplify key EU sustainability regulations. However, despite the shifting tone in some policy circles, stakeholder expectations for meaningful sustainability commitments aren't going anywhere. In fact, if anything, they're rising, especially among investors. Investors are increasingly expecting companies to have clear, credible climate action plans. Why? Because it helps them manage climate-related risks, spot new opportunities in the transition to a net zero economy, and ultimately deliver long-term values for their beneficiaries. Now, a question to our guests. As sustainability evolves from a moral imperative to a core business resilience strategy, are we witnessing the death of ESG or its transformation into something more strategically embedded within long-term business growth? Starting maybe with Mathias.
Thank you, Joséphine, and thank you for having me in this podcast. I would say clearly that this is a transformation into something more strategically. Although politically we see a changing landscape, I think that doesn't mean the long-term process of ESG, the topic of sustainability, that actually we see the death of those. I think the process has been very clear over the past decades, I would say, that this is becoming more and more important for each of the business. Political developments, they have bumps, and then you go backwards. And I think this is also a sign that, you have to improve maybe certain policies. And it's a sign that something becomes more mainstream and becomes more strategically important.
Well, thank you, Joséphine, for the invitation. Thank you for having me here. Well, I agree with Mathias. I don't think ESG is dying. I think it's being reshaped in a different form. I mean, once what we had was instead of having a compliance report being filled just to comply with the rules, now it's becoming part of the strategy of the companies. Social pressure and the society as a whole are not willing to accept anymore was what was accepted years ago. So the process has been evolving to a different shape, and now is become part of the daily life of policies and company strategy.
Thank you. I think, Filipe, you're hinting at a very important point. It could have been another name for this podcast of moving beyond compliance. We're no longer seeing ESG as a checkbox exercise, but something much more important and, as you mentioned, embedded into the daily lives of a corporation. Again, a question to both of you. What are you hearing from investors today? What are their priorities when it comes to ESG and sustainability, and what they're looking at when reviewing companies' performance? Maybe starting with Filipe.
Well, from the point of view of investors, I think one important point is maybe traceability. Having a plan and know exactly the impacts and how ESG measures are being taken and the impact they have in the overall performance of the company. I believe also a very important point is, I think the term is greenwash, is talking without having really a real plan behind or something to sustain the speech. So I think investors are quite willing to have their resources in a company that has a real strategy and a real balance on what is social responsibility and profitability.
Mathias, if you want to add to this, maybe.
I'm probably a little bit less close to investors from what we are doing than Filipe. But I think how I understand it, investors are looking for long-term sustainable investments opportunity and lowering the risks in what they're investing in. And I think the important thing is what Filipe has said, reputational risks, I think, is probably something which can be added or has been added by Filipe also in one or the other way.
And definitely something we'll be talking more about, reputational risk. Filipe, I wanted to ask you something specific on ArcelorMittal's role in the responsible steel standard. Your company has been pivotal in establishing the standard. And so is the message from your stakeholders that there is increased requirement for responsible sourcing and that ESG as well as broader sustainability still matters?
Definitely. We have our own brand on decarbonation steel, and we have been investing and working on circularity as a whole, not only in mining, but steel as well. The point is that the stakeholders started to listen, or they have been listening what the society and the investors have been playing for the last few years. So this also helps to, as you mentioned, to pivot or turn how the company sees the future. I can say that from the point of view of responsibility, we are taking a path that, one, there's no turning back on this. I don't think that there will be a point that we have reached a point of no return. So it's coming to, as I mentioned, to become part of the daily lives of the company. And it's something that we definitely assess before talking on any project or increase in the business.
Thank you. And I think that as stakeholders are listening, as you're mentioning, I found that there is another very valuable document. Mathias, the World Economic Forum publishes an annual World Issues Report, which I found to be very helpful for my own work in taking temperature of what are the global issues that are being discussed. As part of this work, what changes are you seeing in terms of awareness around ESG, circularity, and sustainability?
When I look at the stakeholders we are working with, I think there's clearly an increased awareness of all these three terms. What could be still growing is that we look a little bit above ESG just as it is defined by regulatory frameworks. Also, circularity. I think circularity became kind of a buzzword almost. And a lot of companies or a lot of stakeholders in general still understand that circularity is kind of a little bit an improved recycling effort. So actually still not understanding completely the difference between the linear and the circular economy. Sustainability, of course, it's a very old term. So sustainability, I think it's a mainstream term. Probably still we talk a lot more about environmental sustainability or look at the environmental part of the triple bottom line and not so much, for example, at the social part. But overall, I think there's a high awareness of these terms and of the concepts. Although maybe when I look at it as a scientific person, then probably when it gets into detail, I think there's still some nitty-gritty to do for all the stakeholders.
Thank you. And I find it to be very interesting that you're mentioning circularity as a buzzword that may be considered as something similar to recycled plus, but is in fact much more complex and, as mentioned, of course, circular and not linear. And I'd like to talk a bit more about circularity. It is obviously a hot topic because it talks to both the environmental and social issues that can be minimized through mineral production, improve mineral production through circularity, but it also presents a solid business case for longer term, meaningful business and supply chain sustainability. So meeting different goals within a corporation. Turning myself to Filipe, your role at ArcelorMittal focuses on the use of technology to improve sustainability and introduce circular economy principle within the industry, with a view to enhance resource efficiency and sustainability. Can you share how these technologies are contributing to a more sustainable as well as more circular practices on the ground?
And that's a very good question. We can split into different answers that are complementary. You have first an improvement on the current technology. I mean, I totally agree with Mathias that circularity, it's a reshape or it's an evolution of the recycling that we used to do. So the first thing is using the current technology or the improvement in the technology to improve our own process, the process that are already there. So looking for the mining perspective, if we improve our process and we improve yield, recovery, we generate less tailings, for example, so we need less necessity for circularity, or we make easier the circularity itself. The second part of the answer would be like, we need to stop to look at the mining, let's say tailings or waste as tailings and waste. We need to look at the perspective of byproducts, something that we could learn from the steel, which at some point recycles more than 80% of their byproducts. So of course, we're talking about different volumes here, but they have been investing on these for a long time. And it could be the same for the mining industry. So if we start to treat the waste and tailings as a byproduct, we could find and finance much better technologies to improve and turn them into a useful and very attractive business case. To finish is just for that, we need some portion of R&D. So we need to invest on searching the technology that we will use, because believe me, we don't have use for all the tails and waste that we generate, so we need to find them yet. So for that, we need to invest.
That makes sense. And I think that leads me quite easily to my next question. So investing in research development is one way, but do you have any other practical example that you've seen of actionable strategies for integrating circular economy principle within the mining value chain? So looking at waste as an opportunity is one, but anything else that you could talk to us about?
again, as you mentioned, all depends on the strategy. If we invest and we look at the strategy of the company, how to use your own production, your own byproducts inside of your own processes. This is one. We could use the interactions between the mining and the steel industry to leverage the research one to another. It's when you talk about technology, for example, on the circular economy, you can, the steel side has been investing on this for years. So we have been searching on byproducts and recycling for, 25 and 30 years until we reached a good point of reuse of the materials. Something that on the mining industry, we're just crawling right now. And that's the point that we should invest. Until 150 years ago, we didn't have antibiotics until someone could find an usage for fungus, and something that nobody had ever thought before. And that's, it looks like naive, but it's the kind of approach that we need to have here. So R&D investment and circular economy should take the lead in the next few years, in my opinion.
Thank you. I think that this comment of learning from the steel industry and what that industry has been doing for the past decade is very valuable. Turning myself to Mathias, a bit of a similar question and a double question almost. So I'd like to ask you about, again, practical example you've seen, so successes in implementing circular practices within the mining value chain, things that have worked, but also some challenges in doing so.
I'm probably the wrong person to talk about the technologies. I think a person from the mining industry like Filipe is much better to do that. Maybe another thought on this. Mining industry and circular economy is almost a contradiction because per se, the mining, and I'm talking about primary mining, is actually the beginning of a linear. It could be the beginning of a linear, or where the circular economy fails, where we actually cannot achieve the ultimate aim of the circular economy, not needing any primary resources anymore. Of course, that will never be realistic. So it's also not a criticism about the mining industry, of course. We will always need primary resources, or at least right now, we need that. But having said that, of course, the industry itself still in their operations can apply circular principles in their operations. And Filipe already mentioned tailings, slag, so that actually we invest in technologies to be more efficient in when we are mining, at least let's get out everything or as much as possible and not wasting resources in the mining practice. So that's for sure. But I think and this is more vision, the mining industry ultimately should become and has to change its mindset for it also a little bit to become part of a circular economy. What does that mean? So I think from the inset of business practices, make sure that these resources we are mining, that they actually stay in the loop. And what does that mean? If we're talking about mineral oil, of course, we burn mineral oil. That doesn't stay in the loop anyways. But we are now talking about energy transition minerals or minerals and metals. And I think there are policies or strategies discussed like materials as a service, which actually would put the mining industry at the center of a circular economy. So what if the mining industry has an interest in keeping their minerals and metals in the loop because they actually maybe they keep on owning them or they keep a responsibility for it. So I think, of course, this is all on visionary level. I think we're far away from having solutions for that. But I think this is what I see as a development which has to be happened, that the mining industry is becoming truly circular.
Filipe, I don't know if you have any comments on this. I think this is very much in line with the work that you're conducting at ArcelorMittal.
No, I'm totally in agreement with what Mathias just said. And he put a very good example, which the energy transition is not only bringing circularity into a different level, but also put mining in a spotlight for many different reasons. In that sense, I will come back on what I said before, and I think in line what Mathias just said, we need to change the mindset and look into a different perspective since the beginning of the value chain. I mean, when we mine, we take run of mine, we take waste, and we take tailings in the end. Why not say that we produce three different products? I mean, it all starts with a change in the mindset.
Thank you. And building back on this, Filipe, I'd like to ask you, with a view of making mining more efficient, the role of specific technologies that I'll name briefly, and these would be artificial intelligence in link to digitalisation, and how can these tools can enhance sustainability of mining by making it more efficient. And another very different type of technology, talking about decarbonization. I know ArcelorMittal is a leader on decarbonizing steel. So again, a question on how to make mining more efficient, embedding sustainability practices into the very inception of how you go about your own business.
Well, that's also a very good question. I mean, you mentioned the use of artificial intelligence. This by itself, I believe it's the single biggest breakthrough that we had in the last few years. So this is a game changer in many aspects. This by itself will reshape a lot of things. But the use of technology, it's not only improving the process itself, but improving the whole value chain, like how we ship our products, how we mine, how we depose our tails, how we dewater tails coming from the treatment of the run of mine. So there is a lot of space in terms of technology that we're not feeling yet. A lot of new breakthrough ideas need to come in the next few years so we can catch up with the requirements on ESG right now. On the decarbonization side, you can look, okay, to make a good decarbonized steel, we need a good decarbonized iron ore coming from the mines. That is also mandatory. High quality iron ores. We're talking about, there was a hype on DRI and process with hydrogen and so on, but all of these will require high grade iron ore, high grade minerals. We have been discussing about energy transition, so lithium, copper, cobalt, all those materials, they need to be evolving in terms of technology in recycling and production to catch up with the requirements.
Of course. And we will actually be talking about this topic of mining the gap for this critical and strategic raw material in another of our podcasts, as we know that demand is skyrocketing while we live in a world of limited resources. Something that I'd like to ask you, Filipe, just to close maybe this topic of technology, is there something that technology cannot do? And the reason I'm asking this is, do you see that there's a limit in technology that where there is a gap that needs to be filled by a real mindset shift? This is something that we've talked about, that the mining industry needs to change its entire mindset. But yes, curious on the limitation of the tools that we have and what might be required to further embed circularity or sustainability into mining.
Maybe I can start by focusing really on the mining industry. I mean, the mining industry for years had an aversion for development and breakthrough ideas. So this is something that we need to break the inertia, okay, and make the leaders understanding that we need to invest and improve in many different ways. Mm-hmm. And that's something that technology cannot do. I mean, we can show and and provide the tools, but the mindset has to be there. On the other hand, having that, I don't see limitations for what can be done. What we need to see is the impact that it generates. We can use, for example, iron ore tailings as a sand for concrete. But what will be the impact of this in the local industry or the local society? We cannot just flood the market with a byproduct without taking into consideration what would happen with different small suppliers that the community has. So I think a broader view or a very deep assessment on the impacts on the circularity needs to come before technology scouting. I mean, it's just a way of seeing things.
This is very interesting. I often find that my work on sustainability and circularity has a strong focus on these trade-offs. You decide no longer to source from a certain region, but what happens when you disengage? And you need to understand those trade-offs. And this example on using iron ore tailings as sands for concrete is really a great example for that. Now moving a bit away from mining and directing this question to Mathias, with regards to e-waste and secondary raw materials, you coordinate recycling and e-waste management projects with SECO and UNIDO. Could you share examples of how e-waste or secondary material programs have the ability to reduce pressure on primary mining and foster economic opportunities? Then maybe as a follow-up question, how can mining companies support these efforts?
Yeah, I think the ultimate aim is, of course, that we use better what we have as resources in our built environment, in our consumer products, etc. That actually we keep them in the loop, we keep them circular. That we actually reduce the pressure on having the need to mine primary materials. So that's definitely the case. With our program, which you have mentioned, e-waste also, especially in the global south, I think e-waste is a special case, electronic waste, because it really contains a lot of these materials we are seeking for right now for the energy transition, for new mobility. So kind of the new type of resources we are in demand now. So, and I think it's still underused, the opportunity we have in this area of accessing these materials. It's a little bit different looking at secondary raw material. Instead of exploring geologically an area, I think you could say the exploration of an area is to actually put a collection system right, to put responsibilities for the producers right, so that we have a system in place which is efficient, that we actually can access these materials. When we talk about the global south, important is that we have to understand realities. Realities are also that a lot of this collection and also the recycling is taking part in the so-called informal economy. And I think we need also solutions to work with the informal economy in these regions, because it's just not realistic to just ignore them. So I think there's a lot of these strategies which can be improved in many parts of the world to actually get better access to secondary raw materials. Now, your second questions, you have to repeat.
Of course, but this is really interesting. I think this lesson on having to be pragmatic and working with potentially informal economy is very valuable. My question was, if you foresee any ways in which mining companies can support these efforts, whether it's collection system, improving producer responsibility, as you mentioned, or anything else that can further convey circular goals?
Mining companies, or let's say different stakeholders in the mining value chain, I think they have a lot of knowledge how to access these raw materials. I mean, refining capabilities, understanding metallurgy of the materials, etc. I think this somehow has to grow together. the knowledge needed for secondary raw material from the knowledge which has been created over many decades or even centuries from the mining business, which is much older than the recycling business. I think that's where I also see that mining companies, if they change their mindset, I think they are becoming part of, or they will in the future not just see the primary raw material as their source material. I think the mining, and it's actually happening already, the mining industry will also see the secondary raw materials as their source material. I know that large mining companies are already now investing in recycling activities.
Thank you. And I'd like to go with another question with you, Mathias, because going back to our topic for today of balancing sustainability as something that is catering to both ESG goals, but also business resilience, I'd like to invite you to reflect on how developing nations are working to balance resource extraction with sustainability goals and how potentially global frameworks can influence industry practices.
You mean on a governmental level in the global south, or?
Yes, so that's both on a governmental level, at an industry level. We're seeing a lot of countries catching up with high living standards, and they may need to do so by foregoing sustainability goals. So how can these countries still balance resource extraction which is an imperative from an economic development agenda standpoint, with the sustainability goals, which also are increasingly required from Western consumers? So I'd like to invite you to reflect on this tension and how potentially circularity is one way to go about making resource extraction something that is economically meaningful, yet aligns with the sustainability agenda of consumer countries, such as the Global North.
Yeah, that's a difficult question because mining per se is actually, you could argue it's not a sustainable business in a way that whatever we do, there will always be an impact, no? And this again is not a criticism about the mining industry. It's about us as human beings, that if we want to have access to raw material, we will have an impact on the environment, will have an impact on social. So this always has an impact on something. But of course, how can you mitigate this impact? And it reflects a little bit on the discussions we had so far. Of course, you also, countries in the global south, I think they have to tighten their policies also when they are working with the international industries who eventually mine their resources. So that they tighten the policies, that the level playing field is clear in these countries, that they have the same standards as are somewhere else in the world, etc. I think circularity also plays a role in the sense of that also in these countries, as I said already, you have secondary raw materials, and I think they can have maybe, rather than having policy just on recycling and mining, maybe they have the integrative policy view on what that means for circular economy in the country. Yeah, I think I staying a little bit general because I find it quite tough, the question. There's probably not one recipe just to tell you how they do it. But in the end, it's all about policies, enforcement, governance in these countries, which still in a lot of countries, it's kind of weak.
Thank you. I do think this was a really good answer, and also a really good introduction to my final question before we move to closing remarks. Namely, would you be able to name one action or one policy which you think could have the biggest potential impact in accelerating circular economy principle in mining and the entire value chain globally? So maybe starting with Mathias, because we were just talking about policy, but if there's really one that comes to your mind.
Yeah, it's something I mentioned already. I think if we start to think towards material as a service, what does that mean? So we are not just selling materials and then they are sold and they belong to somebody else. We are maybe leasing materials, or we are providing materials as a service. I think this is probably, or at least in this direction, a policy which can change a lot, because this changes the mindset. We have seen that in the new economy already. I mean, there is services which is already mainstream in some areas, the leasing of chemicals. This is happening already. Of course, in an older economy, everybody bought a car, and now we are sharing cars, we are renting cars. We also receive a lot of services in our daily life, not by owning something, but just by accessing materials or products as a service. And I think that is something which has to be thought further also for primary raw materials.
Thank you. I will definitely be living this podcast with this idea of materials as a service, as a very interesting food for thought. Filipe, the same question. What one action or policy do you think could have the biggest impact in accelerating circular economy principle in the mining value chain?
Well, again, for me, as Mathias, it's a very difficult question. I don't see one single policy doing all the job. I think there will be different impacts. If I may, if I allowed myself to go a little bit further on the question, Joséphine, I think common sense is the best tool that we have. But besides that, the tools that like life cycle assessments and so on may move into the direction that what Mathias just mentioned. I mean, it doesn't make sense to go for electrification or to produce electric steels or electric vehicles in a place or in a country where the energy matrix it's coal-based. So I believe what we need is actually a global standard or a common sense on what would bring benefits in terms of the mining industry and circularity itself. So on this point, we already have a lot of policies, ICMM and many others. But what we need is actually something that makes sense for everybody. So I know that my answer was kind of diffuse, plain Switzerland here, but it's because I don't have one simple answer for that.
I think this was also a really good answer, common sense. It is a very useful remark. Thank you to our speakers for joining us today. Please check out the rest of this special series of Resourcing Tomorrow podcast on the TDI Suits and Boots podcast channel. Hope to see you at this year's event, where the conversation on circularity and sustainability beyond ESG will be continued, and you will get to hear more on today's topic from Mathias and Filipe. Thanks for listening.